This is Speaking of Shakespeare. I'm Thomas Dabbs, broadcasting from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. If you are joining us on YouTube, you should know that this program is also available on your favorite podcast platform. When we began this series in 2020, we necessarily had to feature our guest online only because of the COVID pandemic. In 2023, it was our great pleasure to be able to host two fine speakers for in-person talks for students, faculty, and the general public on our campus here in Tokyo. The first of these talks was by Christopher Highley of the Ohio State University, who kindly allowed us to record this talk and share it online. Here, Chris will talk about his recent book on the Blackfriars district in early modern London. This series has been maintained with support from the Aoyama Gakuin Institute of the Humanities and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science.
Thank you. Right, thank you, Tom, and thanks everyone for being here. Can you all hear me in the back? Give us a thumbs up if you can hear me in the right. If by any chance you can't, or if my voice fades out, you just come and move up. Come to the front. Okay, so I prepared a talk today that's kind of based on a book I just published last year, and I need to pull it up here so you can see what the book's called. This is the book from Oxford University Press. It's called Blackfriars in Early Modern London, Theatre, Church and Neighbourhood. And there I am. So this came out, I think, in March 2022. So today, I'd like to talk about why I wrote this book, why I'm interested in this subject, tell you one or two things about the argument of the book, and the sources that I consulted, that I think, the archives and libraries I went to, and the materials I read in order to write the book, which took me, I think, over 10 years to write. Research and then the writing, the whole process was about 10 years in length. So yeah, as I say, thanks for inviting me, Tom. Thanks for being here. I've only been it's my first time in Tokyo. I've only been here for 3 days, so I'm really enjoying it. It's a little bit of a culture shock coming from the Midwest, but as I say, yeah, I'm really glad I'm here. So there's going to be 3 parts to my talk. The first is going to be about how I reconstruct a small neighbourhood in London, what historical documents I use, what archives I visit to try to recreate a sort of it's kind of a micro history of a neighbourhood in London, and I'll tell you where the neighbourhood is in a second. And then in the second part, I'm going to talk about one of my central research questions, which was what was the relationship between the church and the playhouse in this neighbourhood? Because there's a very important playhouse, a Shakespearean playhouse here, as well as a very interesting and powerful church. Before we get into the talk proper, I'm going to tell you a couple of things about myself. You might think from the talk that I'm a historian, but I'm not. I actually teach in an English department, so most of my teaching is in Shakespeare and early modern literature, Milton, John Donne, Spenser. But my interests are very much cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary, so I'm often mistaken for a historian, but I try to bring the two disciplines together. I'm interested in literature, in history, in its historical context. I'm going to talk about London, but I'm not from London. I'm from England, you can tell that probably, but I grew up in the north of England, in Manchester. Has anyone heard of Manchester? And if so, what do you associate Manchester with? Do we have any football fans? Any Manchester United fans? Don't be shy. This is going to be an interactive lecture. I'm going to ask you for your responses. Anyway, so I'm from Manchester, the home of Manchester United and lots of great music and all that. But for me, growing up in Manchester in the 1970s London was a faraway place. It was the south. Manchester's in the north. It was a faraway place. It was a magical place. The big city, you know, where the Houses of Parliament were in the Tower of London. The Queen was there. Great theatre was there. Everything you wanted in life was there. So I don't know if it was the same for you growing up in different parts of Japan, maybe in the provinces or the hinterland, that you thought of Tokyo as that great place where one day you would go and you would make it, and you know all the opportunities were there. So in a sense, for me, studying and writing about London, it was unfamiliar. It wasn't my hometown. It wasn't, but it was a special place. It always had that kind of allure, that fascination with me when I was growing up. So what I want to do first of all is just introduce you to what early modern London looked like. So are you familiar with the term early modern? The term is often can be sort of translated as the Renaissance, yeah, or Tudor and Stuart, if we want to talk about monarchical dynasties. The Tudor and Stuart period, the Renaissance period, the early modern, but approximately it's the period from the late 15th century to the end of the 17th century in Britain, early modern. So that's the period we're going to look at. Or if you want a shorthand, the Shakespearean period, Shakespeare's era. So I don't know if you're familiar with this website. It's a recent website. It's called The Layers of London. It's free. You can go in there and you can choose historical maps from all different periods in the history of London, and you can superimpose the map onto a map of modern London. And using this tool, you can fade in and out. So here we have, this is a plan of London around the year 1520, but you can see we can fade out, and there's modern London. So it's a geo-referenced historical map, but there are lots and lots of choices for the different layers. Who's been to London? A few of you. Do you have any, if you've not been, do you have any sense of the layout, the topography of London? So it's built on a river. Very important, the River Thames. Here's the River Thames. And let me point out the most important things. So in the east, we have the Tower of London. Have you heard of the Tower of London? Seen pictures of that? Okay, Tower of London, built by the Normans, built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. But of course, London dates back well before that to the Romans. Londinium was a Roman settlement. And this line, you can see this orange line going all the way around here. That is the old Roman wall, the fortification that was built by the Romans to keep out the basically enemy tribes of the period. So some other, and by the way, this area here within the wall is about 1 square mile. It's very small. And today, if you go to London and you go into this area, you're in the City of London with a capital C, the city. And that's where the banks are, the insurance companies, the investment companies. You know, it's where all the money is. Lots of high rises, very, very expensive. Well, it's not a residential area nowadays. This is the central business district of London. But in Shakespeare's day, people lived here, people worked here, people worshipped here. This was the core of the city that Shakespeare would have known. Even though in the 16th century into the 17th century, London is growing at an incredibly fast rate. So the population of London in 1600, it's about 200,000 people. In 1660, it's doubled to about 400,000 people. I mean, it's the fastest growing city in the world in Shakespeare's lifetime. Obviously, it's growing out into the countryside, into these open fields, and it's growing also south of the river, this area down here. So I'll just point out a couple of other features of the city that you might still know of today, and that is this building here is St. Paul's Cathedral. It's the cathedral with the big dome that's very familiar today from photographs, built by Christopher Wren. But the St. Paul's that Shakespeare knew was a completely different building. That building was destroyed in the Great Fire of London in 1666. So the story that I tell and the book that I've written goes up to 1666. It's kind of a watershed moment in the history of London, because the Great Fire that begins in the east, around here, near to the docks and the river, it blows in this direction. The fire consumes everything in this direction up to around here. And so everything is destroyed, including the old St. Paul's. St. Paul's is rebuilt after the fire with that big dome that we know now. The other thing I'll say about this map, it represents London in about the year 1520, so it's London before the Reformation, which is another really important moment of transition in the history of England, not just of London. So the Reformation, just to remind you, is when Henry VIII breaks with Rome. He breaks with the Catholic Church. He breaks with the Pope. He repudiates the Pope. And he declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Let's see. Here we go. So here's an image showing us Henry VIII on his deathbed. You know all about Henry VIII, right? And he's pointing to his son, Edward VI, his only son. I can't go into I don't know how much you know about the Reformation and why Henry breaks with Rome. It's to do with his desire to get a new wife, isn't it? To repudiate his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, who hasn't been able to deliver him any boys, to give him any boys. And so he manufactures this divorce, which he grants himself because the Pope won't grant it. And so in order to do that, he has to basically declare himself head of the church. But everything changes in England at the Reformation. And so to go back to my map, these buildings here, the pink buildings, you can see these pink buildings here and here and up here, here, here. These are all Catholic religious institutions like monasteries, friaries, nunneries. But at the Reformation, Henry VIII closes all of those, right? He kicks out all the religious people, the monks, the friars, the nuns. He kicks them all out, and he seizes their wealth. He seizes their property and all of their wealth, because the church was the wealthiest power in the land, much wealthier than the monarch in the Tudor period before the break with Rome. So suddenly Henry VIII becomes very, very rich, and he redistributes all of this wealth, all of the land, all of these ecclesiastical buildings. He redistributes them to his friends, so they become secular spaces, right? They become repurposed and redeveloped for various secular purposes. But this is kind of theft on a grand scale by Henry VIII. So this is a map that shows London before the Reformation, absolutely chock-a-block with these Catholic institutions. Now that's going to be very important for the story that I tell in my book. Great Fire of London, just to remind you, there it is. St. Paul's Cathedral. There it is burning. All right, totally destroyed. What year is this, the Great Fire? Anyone know? 1666, easy date to remember, yeah. 1666, the Great Fire. Okay, so now the neighborhood that I'm going to talk about, the Blackfriars, is an area about 12 acres in size, and it's right here in the southwest corner of the City of London. All right, there's that black line again, is the old Roman wall, and you can still see bits of the old wall if you go to London today. Here's the city, but now this is a plan of London after the Reformation. All right, so we don't see any monasteries, friaries, nunneries. They've all gone, although their names remain. The names still remain. So like this, Crutched Friars Priory. All right? You can still go to London and you can find the Crutched Friars, the street, right? But it's not it's now after the Reformation, it's not a religious institution. It's just a place name. That's the same with my neighborhood, the Blackfriars. So this, before the Reformation, had been a friary or a priory. That is a very large, wealthy and powerful religious institution that was the home of the Dominican order of friars. You know, and friars were supposedly very pious men who embraced a life of poverty and chastity, and they existed to pray to God and to go out into the community and to do good works, to look after the sick, look after the dying, right? Look after the impoverished. But again, at the Reformation, the Blackfriars, the Dominicans are kicked out. This land and property is seized by Henry VIII, and it's given to Henry's allies and friends to do with what they will. So, I've shown you that Blackfriars neighborhood, about 12 square acres, and I said the fire swept through it and destroyed it. However, the fire didn't destroy the old street patterns, right? The old kind of layout of the streets and the lanes and the alleys, so that when it was rebuilt after the fire, those streets and lanes, they were pretty much in the same space. So what I'm showing you here is a map from the 19th century. It's a fire insurance map, but it really shows you in great detail the names of the different streets in Blackfriars, names of the courts, names of the yards, churchyard, the perimeter roads that go around the east here, and then the west of the Blackfriars district. So it's very useful looking back, reconstructing the neighborhood, to know that the layout of the land, of the buildings, of the major thoroughfares never really changed even after the fire of London destroyed all the standing buildings. Now, as I say, if you go to London today, Blackfriars is not a tourist area. Very, very few tourists go there. It's full of offices. But you will see plaques telling you, reminding you what used to be here. The Priory of the Blackfriars, late 13th century it was founded. All right? And you can see little narrow alleyways, higgledy-piggledy. They aren't sort of perpendicular streets. There are just alleyways going in all directions. It just reminds you of what it would have been like in Shakespeare's day. We see another plaque in Blackfriars just round the corner from that previous one. And this tells us that in 1613, William Shakespeare purchased lodgings in the Blackfriars Gatehouse. course, the gatehouse is long gone, destroyed in the fire. But this reminds us. Shakespeare typically lodged in London. He rented accommodation, right? He stayed with other families. You know what a lodger is? Where maybe you have a spare room in your house and you let it out to a student who needs a place to stay. That's what Shakespeare is. And he moved around London during his career, and he seems to have lodged with different families. But towards the end of his career, so 1613, after he'd sort of made it as a playwright, he was wealthy, he was respected, he had enough money now to buy a home in London. And he actually bought this suite of rooms above one of the gatehouses. And I'll show you what these gatehouses were in a moment. So whether he actually lived there, we don't know. What he was planning to do with the space, we don't know. We just have the indenture, the contract in which he agrees to buy it, and we know how much he paid for it. But he died 3 years later, so he died in 1616. This late part of Shakespeare's life is kind of mysterious. If you go to Blackfriars today, as I say, there's lots of modern offices, but you do see this, the Apothecaries' Hall. Now, apothecaries were like sort of chemists or pharmacists, and they've been around since the 17th century. So Shakespeare would have known about the Apothecaries' Hall in Blackfriars. Of course, the original building was destroyed in the fire. It's now been rebuilt. But it's a nice historical reminder. And so on that map I showed you, in a sense, what takes the place of all those religious buildings after the Reformation are the company halls. So all the businesses, or the guilds, the companies, like the cloth workers, the drapers, the merchant tailors, the goldsmiths, the jewelers, right? They all have their own buildings, their halls, in the centre of London in that 1 square mile. And this is one of them that survives. And many of them still survive today. The Apothecaries' Hall is one of them. Let's move on to the playhouse now. All right, so again, another plan of Blackfriars, of the friary. Let's see. So here's the river, right? And this is a plan of the friary, again, on the eve of the Reformation. So the shaded area, these are buildings. You've got the great church here where the friars would have prayed and had their services. And then you've got various buildings. These are multi-story buildings made out of stone. So they're very substantial. They're very expensive to build. The Blackfriars were a very, very wealthy order, and they had connections at court and connections with the monarch. So they were very affluent, and they were able to build this fantastic, complex of buildings. And then you have these open spaces called cloisters, which would have been grass and flowers, and people would grow plants and vegetables here. But there are different buildings. There's a refectory where the monks would have eaten. They would have had their meals there. There are dorters, D-O-R-T-E-R, where they would have slept. There's a library. There are different buildings that would have been occupied by different members of the Dominican order. We have a garden here. So here's the gatehouse. Can you see that? East Gatehouse. That is where Shakespeare bought property. But you've also got a main gatehouse to the north. You've got a south gatehouse here. And you have another gate here. So before the Reformation, these religious compounds typically had a wall around them. All right, so we've got the wall, the Roman wall around the city of London, which is up here. But then within this corner of London, we've got another enclave or compound, which has got its own wall. So this line is a wall. It's like a gated community. Are you familiar with that term? We use it in America, like a little community of homes, and there's some sort of a gate around the neighborhood to prevent outsiders from getting in. Well, only various entry points. But these buildings and the wall, they were not destroyed at the Reformation. They were just given to different owners, and they were for different uses. And so this part of the friary, which is called the Parliament Hall, because it was a great big open hall, very tall, very long. Parliament actually used to meet here before the Reformation. And it was this space, part of this space, that became Shakespeare's Blackfriars Theatre. So that's the theatre I'm talking about in my book. You've all heard of the Globe Theatre. Shakespeare's big hexagonal amphitheatre. It's open to the elements. It's got a thatched roof. You've all seen the Globe, right? But Shakespeare's company had two theatres for most of his working life. One was the Globe, and the other was the indoor Blackfriars Theatre, which was much, much smaller. And it was built in the southern part here of the old Blackfriars Monastery. Are there any questions so far? I don't mind if you ask questions, if you want me to clarify things. Okay. All right, so in trying to reconstruct this neighborhood, how do I go about that? Well, basically, I just try to read everything that survives about the Blackfriars. And I'm going to go through some of the documents in a moment. So I tried to read all the surviving property records, leases, indentures, rental agreements. I tried to read all the wills I could find of people who lived in the area. Yeah, I tried to look at all the parish records, because this London is divided into over 100 parishes, right? Small ecclesiastical units. Every parish has got a church. And in this case, the parish overlapped perfectly with this ecclesiastical precinct, and the parish was called St. Anne's. So I'll be talking a fair bit about St. Anne's Parish. But let's just go back to the theatre for a minute. So this is the indenture, or the agreement, between James Burbage, Shakespeare's friend and colleague, right, and this owner, this lord, Sir William Moore, who owned that part of the Blackfriars Monastery, right? Though his ancestor had been granted this property and land by Henry VIII. And so now he's selling it. He's either selling bits of it off, or he's leasing it out to other people to make money. All right? And in 1596, James Burbage, who is the kind of the head of this theatrical company called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, that's Shakespeare's company, he decides, I'm going to spend the enormous sum of £600. That is a lot of money. He's going to spend that to buy all those 7 great upper rooms, as they are now divided, being all upon one floor, and sometime being one great and entire room with the roof over the same, covered with lead, together also with all the lead that cover the same 7 great upper rooms, and also all the stone stairs leading up unto the leads or roof, and also all that great pair of winding stairs with the staircase thereunto belonging, which leadeth up unto the same 7 great upper rooms out of the great yard. So you can see the wording is very archaic and long-winded and repetitive, but it's a legal document. So they have to kind of cover their bases and make sure that it's absolutely crystal clear what is being sold and what is being bought. But basically, Burbage is getting 7 great upper rooms. Maybe, let's say it's the size of this lecture room, but it's on an upper story. And he's also buying the stairs, 2 sets of large staircases that go up to this upper story. And the playgoers are going to go up those staircases. They're going to arrive in the great yard, maybe by coach. If you were a wealthy playgoer, you might come by coach, be dropped off in the great yard. You'd go up the winding stairs and you'd go into the the great upper rooms. But Burbage's plan is to convert those 7 rooms into 1 room. In other words, when he buys it, there are these partitions creating 7 different rooms in what had been this old Parliament chamber when the friars were there. Burbage's plan is to convert it into a theatre by knocking down those partitioning walls, creating 1 space, and then putting in benches, putting in galleries, and it's going to look something like this. There's that 7 great upper rooms converted into 1 theatre. Now this is a speculative or a conjectural design. We don't have a lot of primary evidence for what the theatre looked like. So this is somebody's best guess, if you will. But you can see the bench seating here. You can see the stage, raised stage with galleries up here. I think these curtains would have opened for musicians, would have sat on the galleries here. There are galleries for spectators. But it's a very, very grand space. Remember, this is where Parliament had met. In fact, when Henry VIII held an inquiry into the legitimacy of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, and papal delegates were invited to London to discuss the nature of his marriage, this is where those discussions took place. This was a fitting, dignified place for such a high matter of state to be discussed. They took place in the Blackfriars Great Chamber. So it's very strange that parliamentary chamber where kings had debated these great matters of state would one day, several decades later, become a theatre, a playing space. Now, if you're ever lucky, if you ever find yourselves in the town of Stanton, Virginia, in the United States, you'll find a reconstruction of the Blackfriars Playhouse. And this is what it looks like. So they put on Shakespeare plays all the time, and plays by Shakespeare's contemporaries. And you can see it's an indoor playhouse. There's no windows, we think, so you have to use candles. These would all have been real candles burning there. And of course, they'd drip wax. And so during a performance of a play here, you'd have to change the candles once they start guttering or dripping wax. So during a scene break, right, or an intermission, if you like, the stage crew would come out, there'd be pulleys, they'd lower the candelabra, and they'd change all the candles, put in new candles, winch them back up again, and off you go. Act 2, Scene 1, we start again. And in fact, in some Shakespeare plays, you can actually tell where Shakespeare has included a scene break in the knowledge that that's the point where the candles are going to need to change. There's a famous example of this in The Tempest, which we're pretty sure was performed at the Blackfriars. Let's see. It's another picture here of a performance underway in the Blackfriars. It's an amazing space. It's very compact, very crowded. If you're lucky, you pay a few more dollars, you can actually sit on the stage. Right? And this was a practice in Shakespeare's day, that audience members could sit on the stage, they could be right in the middle of the action. It's well worth doing if you ever go. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more now about how I reconstructed the neighborhood, more about the evidence that I consulted, the sources I used. What about archaeological evidence for the Blackfriars, for these 12 acres? There's very little, unfortunately. Okay, so what I'm showing you here are 2 objects which you can see in the Museum of London. One's a carved boss, one's a grotesque head. There's the grotesque head, the carved boss, and this is the top of some sort of a walking cane. So we don't know when these were discovered, but what they tell us, is that the fabric of the original friary must have been extremely elaborate and impressive. I mean, this was a building that would have cost a lot of money. They didn't skim. You know, it was beautifully decorated on the inside and the outside. And of course, the fact that the playhouse is built on an upper story doesn't permit any later ground level archaeology. Now, so with the Globe Theatre, you know, that are built at the ground level, you can evacuate the foundations of the Rose and the Globe, but because the Blackfriars existed on an upper story, you can't do the same thing and make, you know, sort of draw conclusions from the ground level archaeological evidence. But as you wander around Blackfriars today, you do still find a few fragments of the old friary. This is just a sort of a random wall. It doesn't tell us a great deal. So the material cultural side of things, the physical evidence, it's not that great. I mean, there's a lot of work going on now at the theatre at the Curtain. These are other public playhouses. There's archaeological work still going on and discoveries being made in different parts of London, but not at the Blackfriars, because it's just been so overbuilt over the generations since that it's no good. We do have some fantastic, really helpful manuscript plans of parts of the Blackfriars. I found this at the London Metropolitan Archives in a little box full of really dirty manuscripts that you had to unfold. They weren't properly indexed or catalogued. It was just by chance that I found some property deeds, and this is really unique. This map this is actually the east side of the precinct, and so it gives us the name of streets. We can see this says Shoemaker's Row, and so then you can superimpose this onto other maps and plans that we have. We've got the names of the people who are renting or leasing these different properties. We've got gardens here. You can see where the gardens are. We've got stables for horses. We've also got dunghills are marked on here. So the names of the people living here. You can see where there are stairs leading up and down. There's a reference to a school, to tennis courts, to a church. I mean, this kind of evidence is like pure gold if you're trying to reconstruct the layout and the fabric of a historical neighborhood. And there are measurements, feet. There are actually feet given, so you can actually figure out how far the playhouse was from the church. How close were they? That's a very important question, as we'll see. This is a plan I found that was created after the Great Fire. All right? So after the Great Fire, surveyors went round the burnt-out area and they made these drawings, these sketches of all the properties that had once been there. Because people needed to know, where was my property? The land I owned, where did it begin and end in relation to neighbours and other properties and businesses? It was very, very important. But they also made a sketch of the church, St Anne's Church, just close to the playhouse, right? You can see that says Blackfriars Church. You get the dimensions, entrance, church entry, this says here. That says north there, so we know the orientation. And you can see the little steeple. So this is really, it's the only sort of visual evidence we've got for how big the church was, what orientation it was on, and other things like that. But let's go back to in more legal documents, right, that I read. These are indentures, so lease agreements. And here's Sir William Moore. We've already met him. He sold the 7 great upper rooms to Burbage But there's dozens of these in the archives, so you can find them at the Folger Shakespeare Library and at the Surrey County Archives. So they're scattered all over the world, but I had to sort of research and dig them out and then read them. And you might think, wow, how did he read that? Look at that very crabbed handwriting. Okay, it's not actually that difficult. It's called secretary hand. And you don't really need to study paleography or ancient handwriting to be able to read it. You get the hang of it by practicing it. And it's very formulaic. Legal documents, indentures like this are very, very formulaic. So you get the same phrases repeated over and over again in every document. So that obviously the names of the individuals change, the dimensions, but the names of streets change. But a lot of the formulas are the same. And you can see how it begins. This indenture made, and there's a date, something of March, in the 5th, I think it's the 5 and 30th year of the reign of our sovereign lady Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, Scotland, Ireland, defender of the faith, blah, 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 blah. You know, that comes at the beginning. And then you get the names of the people in the indenture, basically the seller, or the leaseholder, and then the leasee. In this case, a man called Robert Duncan. So what these tell us, right, they tell us about the people who are living and buying this property in the Blackfriars, and it often tells us what their occupations are and how much the property's worth, how much the rent's going to be every year, and where the property's located, maybe what street it's on, what other buildings it's close to, and what its dimensions are. And what this tells us is that Robert Duncan is a citizen and a cordwainer. He makes shoes and boots, all right, out of very fine leather. Of a messuage, that's an old-fashioned word just for a property, a house, and cellar, and 2 tennis courts paved with stone. So that's part of this transaction. He's actually getting all of these different spaces. And it's very interesting because as a cordwainer, Sir William Moore, okay, so the landlord, he demanded not just money in rent, but 1 good pair of winter boots every year. That was part of the rental this agreement with William Duncan. You're going to make me a pair of good winter boots every year, plus the money. And you find this in these indentures often. You'll find that Sir William Moore, or whoever the landlord is at the time, and it's usually Moore or his son, for a later generation, they'll often demand from the leasee maybe glassware, if the person is a glass maker, or there was another one. There's another lease where the leasee makes very high quality fur hats. So Moore says, I want you to supply me with 6 beaver hats every year, made from beaver skin, plus the money. So you learn all kinds of interesting details from these legal documents, which might at first seem really kind of dry and all this legalese, but they're not. They reveal all kinds of fascinating things about the nature of the built environment and the people who are living there and working there. So this is just a summary of that indenture. What does it tell us? It tells us that, there's the reference to the good pair of winter boots. But this is very important. All of these indentures will say that the leasee is required to uphold the liberties, privileges, and customs of the Blackfriars. That's the wording. Comes up over and over again. In this case, because Duncan is acquiring tennis courts, this lease agreement says that he must maintain quietness and order on the tennis court to avoid disturbing Sir William, that is more, and the neighbours. Right, so you get a sense now, this is a neighbourhood where people live very close together, on top of each other, and you've got to mitigate noise. We can't have young people playing really noisy tennis games late at night and disturbing the neighbours. So you get a sense of how this community is functioning, what its kind of concerns and worries are. Duncan also agrees that if he's going to sign this contract, he must contribute to the scavengers and ministers of the church. So he's got to pay money every year to make sure that the local church can function in the parish, St Anne's Church, that the ministers are going to have the income they need, and that the scavengers are paid. The scavengers are the people who go around collecting junk and trash, garbage, whatever you want to call it, dead animals on the street. The ones who just clean up, the scavengers. So they're very important, though, in parish life because they maintain, just a certain level of hygiene and cleanliness on the streets of this little community. But so it's this other formulation, this other requirement to uphold the liberties, privileges, and customs of the Blackfriars, and that really intrigued me when I kept coming across that formulation time and time again. But what it means is that if you were lucky enough to live in this 12-acre enclave, the Blackfriars, with these walls around it and the gates that were closed every night, right? You were living in what was called an ex-ecclesiastical liberty. And that meant that you were not subject to the governance of the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs and the other officials who ran life in London. In other words, you were like living in a self-governing community. Now, sure, you had your own law enforcement officials, you had your own court, you had constables who kept watch and supposedly kept the peace, but the Lord Mayor, who was in control of the rest of London, right? He couldn't come in and bother you. He couldn't send his officials in and make arrests because you were a liberty. So what this means is that before the Reformation, when the friars had lived here, they had these special privileges, that they were self-governing. They really were not subject to the authority either of the monarch or of the city, right? You might have heard of the notion of sanctuary. So criminals, this is before the Reformation, criminals, people on the run from the law, could go into a liberty like the Blackfriars, and they could claim sanctuary, so they couldn't be arrested, because the Lord Mayor and the king couldn't send in their officials to do the arrest. Now, the right of sanctuary disappeared at the Reformation, but these, what had been ecclesiastical liberties, they continued after the Reformation, even after they lose their religious function, they continue to enjoy certain liberties, privileges, and customs. And this means that the residents there are forgiven certain taxes, right? They don't have to pay certain taxes that other citizens of London have to pay. They don't have to perform certain duties that other citizens of London have to perform. So it's a good deal. It's a very nice place to live because it gives you a kind of autonomy and an immunity from these outside authorities, and you can kind of participate in your own self-government. So that's what we mean by a liberty. And of course, these liberties were very, very carefully guarded and upheld by the landlord and by the leading residents of the Blackfriars precinct. Why wouldn't they be? Yeah, they want to maintain their privileges. They're very lucky. People wanted to live there, and there were many wealthy people living in Blackfriars and similar precincts precisely because of this. Okay, well, so I've been talking mostly here about the buildings, the streets, the physical infrastructure of the place. But then I want to find out more about the people who lived here, the residents. So where do I go for this information? Well, first of all, I go to parish records. So, as I say, London comprises over 100 parishes. They're all really, really small, these parishes, for the most part, within the square mile of the city of London. And beginning in 1538, every London parish was required to keep 3 books. One book contained all of the baptisms in the parish, a list of all the children that were baptized. And another book contained the lists of all the burials. And another book contained a list of all the people who were married. So you've got your baptismal, your marriage, and your burial records. And what I'm showing you here is the baptismal record for the year. See, I can zoom in a bit here. For the year 1588. So this was written in 1588. And who was buried in this year? Well, we see up here, I highlighted a few examples to show you the range of people that lived as neighbours. You get a sense that, my assumption was that this was a neighbourhood populated mostly by the gentry and the elite, the rich. But as you read through these records, you see, oh no, it's much more diverse than that. There's people of all different social ranks. But here you see James Sewell, cook to my Lord Seymour. So we know that Lord Seymour has a house here, and this is his cook who's died. And it's intriguing that they actually tell us that James Sewell was a cook, because often we don't, the occupations of the people are not recorded. But here it is. Then we have next a chrism of John Lasker French. A chrism, you're probably not familiar with that word. It means a child, a newborn child, probably under 3 months old, that's died and has been buried. The chrism cloth was the cloth in which the child was christened. So that word chrism came to mean very young children, babies just weeks or months old. So it's a poor little baby. We're not told what the baby's name was, but the baby was the son of, the son or the daughter, we're not even told the sex of the child, of John Lasser French. And that word French, when I started noticing in these records nationalities, French, German, Dutch, I realized, what's all this about? Why are there so many foreigners living in the Blackfriars? And I'll get onto that in a minute. But you can see a chrism, a child of Mr. Chiddleton. And then we come on to 1589, a chrism of Lewis the Cutler. So it's very, it's moving, it's emotional to read these records, which seem so sort of dry and perfunctory when they're talking about these children who haven't really made it beyond the first weeks of life being buried in the churchyard at Blackfriars. And then you will see family names coming up over and over again, and it's the child, the next child of that family that hasn't survived and is being buried. And I think we see here that two twins of Cornelius Wilborn are buried at the same time. So the twins die. They're not given names. We don't know how old they are. A couple of other names worth pointing out. Mr. John Thompson, merchant. So we've got cooks, we've got lords, we've got merchants. Merchants would belong to sort of the middle class, the middling sort. But we've also got servants, right? Richard Taylor, servant to my Lord Cobham. Lord Cobham, we know who Lord Cobham was, very powerful nobleman. He's living in Blackfriars, but of course, noblemen are going to have servants. So we've got this full sort of range of social positions. Then we have here Nicholas Goldsmith, the cobbler French. See, there's another example I see. We saw French before, now we see French again. Why are these parish officials, this would be the parish clerk, whose job it is to make all these entries, why is he telling us that they're French? Why is he telling us their nationality? So that was something that puzzled me and that I had to do research on. But you can see how, on the surface, these documents seem sort of very bare and minimalist. But when you read them closely, they reveal all kinds of things about the social structure of the neighborhood, the social relations within the neighborhood, and what have you. Let's see, how are we doing for time, Tom?
We're fine. We have about 15 more minutes.
Oh, okay, so I'm going to skip some stuff here. I mentioned wills. Really, really important, really fascinating. And again, you might think these are as dry as dust. I mean, trying to read that document. Again, it's that cramped secretary hand, but really, once you spend several days reading them over and over again, you get the hang of it. You start to recognize what does a letter S look like, a letter, P. At first they seem odd and strange, but then you start to see patterns, and you get the hang of it. And again, they're very formulaic. So they always tend to start with, in the name of God, amen. I, William de Learn, and it goes on to say, preacher of the French church. Well, I can't, it's too small for me to read right now, but what do we learn? What did I get from reading this will? It's by a man called William de Learn, who died in 1616. He lives in Blackfriars. He's a physician, but he's also a preacher of the French church, or at the French. So there's that word French again. And in his will, of course, he makes all his bequests. He leaves his money and his property and his assets to his family members, but also he leaves money to the poor. And that's very typical for wealthy people at this time. They would leave money in their wills to the poor. Or maybe they would leave money to make sure that a sermon could be read every year on the anniversary of their death. But this is interesting again because we've got the French. He leaves money not just to the poor of the Blackfriars, but the poor of the French church. All right? So what I eventually figured out is that Blackfriars is a very attractive neighborhood for immigrants to come and settle and work. Mostly French, and these people were religious refugees. So if you know anything about what was happening in France in the middle to late 16th century, there were wars of religion taking place. And Protestants were being persecuted. And what do you do when you're being persecuted? You flee. You get the hell out and you go somewhere safe. And England, under Edward VI and then later Queen Elizabeth, became very hospitable towards these French and Dutch, German Protestant refugees. The French were known as Huguenots. You might be familiar with that term, the Huguenot community. And that one of the reasons that Elizabeth liked these immigrants, or strangers as they were called, is that they were very, very skilled workers. They were very well educated, for the most part, they were very well educated, and they were very skilled artisans, so like goldsmiths, jewelers, watchmakers. So of course, the monarch would invite these people in because they'd help boost the economy. But of course, many, many English workers resented their presence because they were seen as taking jobs away from them. And they bring their religion with them. Queen Elizabeth allows these Protestant refugees, these Huguenots, to establish their own church in London called the French Protestant Church. And the brand of Protestantism that they're allowed to practice is quite different from the brand that Elizabeth allows her own English subjects to practice in the Church of England. So this tells us the religious landscape of England and of early modern London especially is extremely varied. You've not only got Protestants and Catholics, although the Catholics are kind of underground. They're kind of worshipping in secret at this time under Elizabeth. But you've also got different kinds of Protestants living together. And yes, so he was a preacher. This man was a physician, but he was also a preacher in the French church. Why did the strangers come to Blackfriars? Because it was a liberty. Because it gave them it allowed them certain privileges that they wouldn't have been afforded elsewhere in London. Specifically, it allowed them to ply their trade without the interference of the guilds. So those occupational organizations I told you about, the trade guilds, the companies, like the cloth workers, the goldsmiths, the bakers. Think of any occupation that they have a trade organisation that looks after the interests of their members, that oversees the training of apprentices, that sort of regulates their business. And those native English girls, they didn't want these highly trained strangers coming to London and taking all the best jobs and putting their own members out of work. So they were typically hostile to the strangers. But in a liberty like the Blackfriars, the guilds could not reach, they couldn't interfere. Again, the liberty was a kind of an autonomous zone that allowed the strangers to practice their trades and their skills unmolested by the guilds and immune to the regulations of the guilds. I mean, it was very controversial, and the guilds were always petitioning the crown and the mayor to try and extend their reach and their power into the liberties, to try and curb the activities of these foreigners or strangers, but it was always a struggle that went on throughout this period. So I've got another will here, a will of a woman, a widow, Dame Agnes Finch. It's a very, very interesting will that I was so excited when I read this one, because it just tells us so much about her and her kind of family situation. It tells us where her actual house was located in Church Court, so we could kind of go back to those maps and we could actually find where Church Court was. But we know how wealthy she was because she bequeathed to her mother. Yeah, so this is actually the will of the daughter, Agnes, and her mother, Dame Agnes, is still alive. So the daughter here is sick. She's very wealthy. She's leaving a coach and a coach mares to her mother. So she's got horses, coaches, stables. But she's also leaving legacies to women who she says, are now dwelling with me. So it seems that there's this little, I don't know how little it is, but her house is like a boarding house almost, or a community of grown single women, which I thought was kind of neat, kind of unusual, that you would find these mature, independent women, they were probably all widows, right, living together under the same roof. And one of the things I figured out, because Agnes Finch leaves property to the preacher at the Blackfriars, a man called William Googe, right? She leaves him her high gilt salt cellar with a crystal in the midst of it and a cover to it and £5 in money. Now, a silver salt cellar is if you ever go to the British Museum and you go into the silver section, you'll see lots of salt cellars, because they were very prestigious domestic artifacts that you'd put your salt in and you'd position it on the table, and you'd be showing off how wealthy you were with this beautiful, because it was a beautifully ornate object, right? And so for her, for Agnes Finch to leave the salt cellar with a crystal, it's got a crystal in it, as well as this money, to her preacher, tells you how much she respected him. And William Googe, we know a lot about him as the preacher. He was very, very godly, a very strict Protestant. We might almost call him Puritan. And it's my theory, from looking at this will, that these women they formed part of a bunch of groupies, if you're familiar with that term, who were devoted to this Puritan preacher, William Googe, their local preacher, right? They were devoted to him. So they were these sort of godly Puritan widows who lived together, prayed together, worshipped together, and supported the religious mission of a man like William Googe. Now, the interesting thing here is that William Googe is an English clergyman. He's in the Church of England, but as a Puritan, he's not happy with the Church of England. He wants to see more changes within the Protestant English Church. He wants it to be reformed even more. And the church that he would have looked to as the ideal Protestant church was the French Protestant Huguenot congregation, right? And so there's this natural affinity between the Blackfriars preachers, and there's only two of them. They have very long tenures. They live a long time. There's William Googe and his predecessor, a man called Stephen Edgerton. There's an affinity between these two English Puritan preachers and these French Huguenot Protestant settlers in Blackfriars. They're on the same page. But the French version of Protestantism is much more austere, much more reformed than the official Church of England version of Protestantism. For instance, in the Church of England, you still have bishops. And Puritans don't like bishops. There are no bishops in the Huguenot French church. There are elders. It's a much more kind of democratic, not so much a hierarchical structure in the French Protestant church. And so from other research I did, I found out that the Huguenot French community, many of them were living in close quarters to these English Puritans in Blackfriars. They would attend both the St. Anne's Church and also the French Protestant church up the road. So there was kind of a confluence of religious ideas, and they were quite sort of non-conformist or semi-conformist people who, William Gouge and Agnes Finch and these people, they were within the Church of England. They weren't separatists. They didn't want to sort of break away, but they wanted to reform it from within. They wanted to make it more like this French Huguenot or Calvinistic church. All right. So I'll skip on to, spent a long time on part one, but the central question I became interested in is how did these two communities live together, coexist side by side? So you've got the religious community I've been talking about, the godly, the Puritans, and then you've got all the people connected to the playhouse. How did they get along for so long without clashing? Because you might think that Puritans disliked theatre, right? That's the cliche, that's the stereotype. And if I go on here, I can read you something from what's called an anti-theatrical tract written by this man Alexander Leighton, and it's called A Short Treatise Against Stage Plays, 1625. So it's written a little after Shakespeare's lifetime, but these sentiments are very widespread. They're typical in Shakespeare's day. So here we go. Stage plays are repugnant to the written word and will of Almighty God, and dangerous to the eternal salvation both of the actors and spectators. So if you go to a play, you're likely to be damned to hell forever. That's pretty serious anti-theatricalism, isn't it? All right? So what I suspected was that if the preachers in the Blackfriars were godly Puritans, didn't they think this way? And if you think this way, how could you live with actors and playgoers on your doorstep every day? So what's going on here? And I decided that, I came to the conclusion, let's say, that if you're actually a preacher, a clergyman in a parish, with a flock, with a congregation that you have to look after, you've got to adjust your views. You've got to be more accommodating, more conciliatory. Even though in theory you might hate theatre, you've got to, for the sake of peace and stability and social order, you've got to kind of put up with it. And so this is another preacher. This is William Gouge's predecessor, the godly preacher Stephen Egerton. And this is what he says about his flock or his congregation. Consider how easily, without irksomeness, they, that is, you, my congregation, they can be present at a play or at some other profane and idle exercise and discourse of greater length than those sermons which they do so much distaste in respect of the tediousness, as they esteem it, of them. And therefore they ought much more patiently to bear the protracting of time at the performance of such a holy duty. All right, so I read hundreds and hundreds of pages written by Stephen Egerton and William Gouge, their sermons that were printed. Many of them were printed, right, and their other religious writings. I read hundreds and hundreds of pages, sifting through them for references to theatre, playhouses, because, they're living right in the shadow. His church is right in the shadow of Shakespeare's Blackfriars Theatre. There's very, very little. They say very little about the theatre. But this is one of the things that Egerton says. And to me, that implies that, yes, he doesn't really like theatre. Theatre is a profane and idle exercise. It's a waste of time. But he's not condemning it, is he, in the terms of that earliest invective is condemning theatre. All he's saying is, look, it would be nice if you could try to listen at my sermons as closely as you listen at those damn plays. He's not sort of saying, never go to the playhouse because you'll be damned to hell for eternity. He's saying, yeah, I don't really, they're not good, but there's not much I can do about it. We've got to get along. And so here's another quotation from Egerton's successor in the Blackfriars pulpit, this very famous godly preacher, William Googe. And this is from his funeral sermon, right? After he died. He lived a very long life. He doesn't die until into the 1650s. I mean, he's in Blackfriars for several decades. But in his funeral sermon, he's praised, quote, for composing all differences among his people, among whom he was, as it were, a justice of peace as well as a minister of peace. If he could not hinder dissensions from being born, he would not suffer them to be long-lived. In other words, his mission, one of his missions in life as the priest, the clergyman, the preacher in Blackfriars, was to make sure that people got along. He wanted social harmony. He wanted to build a sense of community. How are you going to do that if you're in your pulpit lecturing about how evil the playhouse is, when he knows there are people in that congregation who are probably actors, who are certainly people who are going to the theatre, or people who make their living off the theatre? All right, so he has to modulate and he has to temper what he says in order to promote social harmony, because that is an imperative for preachers in this period, is to make sure that your little community, your parish, which might only be a few thousand people in size, is actually allowed to function harmoniously. So let me see now. A couple of other reasons why that just shows you where all the parishes are in London, over 100, right? Each number is a parish. There's Blackfriars, 18, right in the southwest corner. For every parish, there's a church, a parish church, and a minister, a preacher like Egerton or Googe. Of course, they're not all these kind of godly Puritan types. Some of them are much more moderate. But that's what London is, this patchwork of different religious jurisdictions with different personalities and different social groupings in each parish. But that's a whole different talk. But I think two other reasons I'll just mention finally for why the theatre and the church were able to get along and coexist for as many decades as they did is that once the theatre moves in, suddenly those outsiders, the actors, the playgoers, that the local residents maybe feared and thought of as, oh, they're dangerous, they're dirty, they're going to bring trouble. But as soon as they move in and the theatre opens, suddenly those people become neighbours. They become people who are shopping at your shop, right? They become people who are sitting next to you in church. So the fear disappears or is kind of modulated, right? So the strange becomes familiar. When the theatre opens, of course, many of the people in the neighbourhood who'd lived there for maybe years and years and years and who had deep reservations about having a theatre open down the road, suddenly they find that there are lots of playgoers coming to their shop and buying things, and business is booming. It's great. And think of all the businesses you need to sustain a theatrical enterprise. We've mentioned the candles, right? So the wax chandlers, people who make wax candles, are going to be supplying the theatre. Carpenters, people who maintain the physical structure of the theatre. Booksellers, people who are catering to the audiences, to the hundreds of people that are coming every week to this Blackfriars Theatre. Even though it's a small theatre, you can only get in about between 400 and 600 people, that's still a lot of business on the streets of Blackfriars. And those people are buying food, they're buying drink, and they're buying other consumer goods. From everything from feathers, which is one of the jokes in the plays of the period about the fact that there were many feather makers living in the Blackfriars, and what is more a sign of vanity and frivolity than a feather, you might think. And yet it was apparently these French and Dutch immigrants were expert feather makers. So they were both very religious, but they're making these fashion accessories. But so suddenly these businesses might have found themselves thriving from all the new customers and all the demands, the economic requirements that the theatre was making. And so I suddenly, I sort of developed these theories that there's all kinds of reasons to explain why how theatre and church coexisted for so long. And the final point then I will just say is that when we think about London, or I was used to think about London when I first became interested in it as a subject of study, when I was teaching courses, I would think of London as monolithic. Like it was the city of London, it was just one big thing. But it's not true at all. It's not just a monolith, it's not just one thing. It's made up of the hundreds of different little communities and subcultures, all right? With their own, each parish with its own religious identity, with its own economic priorities, with its own concerns. And parishes might be these very small parishes in the centre of the city. They might be along the river bank, where they'd have a completely different character in terms of the trades that were practiced here. Or they might be these large parishes out here. You can see 105. Look how big that is compared to these. These were called extramural parishes because they were outside the walls. There's intramural, extramural. This is where the development was happening. The growth, right? This is where the slums were being built. The cheap tenements on alleyways and lanes. So you get lots of poorer people living out here. Wealthy people tend to live in the very centre. But every community is different. So one of the things I learned from this book, and I want to keep exploring, is just the kind of the cultural, religious, social richness, variety, and diversity of early modern London. I also, though, realised that even though there was this coexistence between, so Shakespeare's theatre didn't open until the year 1608. His company didn't get access to that space until 1608. They'd had the Globe since 1599, and they performed there until 1642, and all theatres are closed in London by the order of Parliament. So that's a long time. Now, there were moments in that long period where the neighbours tried to have the theatre, if not closed down, regulated in some way. So some of the neighbours would occasionally issue these petitions to the government and to the mayor, or even to Parliament. They'd issue petitions saying, we're being inconvenienced by the theatre with the crowds and what have you. Please do something about it. But nothing ever happened. And my theory is that those petitions were only issued at times of particular stress in the neighbourhood. So stress may be brought about by the plague, bad plague years. So I talk about this in my book. If you go through those parish records year in, year out, you can both see the increase in the number of births year in, year out, because the Blackfriars is growing, but you can also see what the bad plague years are. The really bad plague year, I remember there was one year where the parish clerk had annotated all the deaths, PL, 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 meaning that person died of plague. So imagine, after the plague, there's a sense of crisis in the community. It's a moment like that of instability which might prompt another petition against the theatre, or maybe there's an economic downturn, a moment of crisis. So it wasn't that everyone got along happily and they all compromised and accommodated one another. There were these ups and downs, bumps in the road, but there were clearly factions within the Blackfriars parish, people who put up with the theatre, people who were sort of morally objected to it, and those who felt they were economically advantaged. Even the small community like the Blackfriars was itself sort of conflicted and divided. So thank you very much for listening to me ramble on about my fascination with the Blackfriars neighbourhood and theatre. I hope one day you'll get to visit. If you ever go to London, make sure you visit the neighbourhood. It's not on the tourist itinerary, but it's a fantastic place to visit. And I'll just, hang on Tom, I'll just show them one more image here that I should have put up earlier. And there's the bell telling me that it's time to go to church, because the bells would ring in London all the time. One reason was to tell you it was time to go to the church service. But there's the Blackfriars here, and right across the river is the Globe. You can see that, the famous Globe on the south bank. They're very close together. You'll go, nowadays all the tourists go to the Globe. Nobody goes to the Blackfriars, but well worth a wander round. Thank you very much.